Hi, so this video is going to be about the general topic of gender. Okay, so just to reiterate an important point, there is a difference between sex and gender. All right, so sex refers to biological characteristics. So these are things like our chromosomes, hormones, actual anatomy, and reproductive systems. Okay, gender, however, refers more to social expectations, identity, meanings attached from society and culture. So, for example, this is where we'll get ideas of things like masculinity and femininity, right? So, sex is biological, gender is more of a social construct. Right? So, one way to think about this is that a society may teach that boys should be emotionally tough and girls should be nurturing, right? Those are expectations of gender roles, but it's not biology, right? So, gender is a social construct, meaning societies create and reinforce those ideas about what genders are, quote unquote, supposed to be. Okay? So with that in mind, what we're going to see, because it's so dependent on the actual society, gender is not understood or approached the same way across the world. Right? So different cultures throughout time and place have different ideas. Right? So if we look at some of the indigenous populations, for example, all right, so many of the Native American communities recognized gender diversity long before colonization occurred and European society came in. Right? So this is often exemplified in what they call the two-spirit identity. Right? So rather than seeing gender as strictly male or female, some of these indigenous cultures view gender more fluidly, and they actually valued in many ways those who crossed those traditional gender roles. Okay? But colonization did eventually come, and so with that came the social norms and cultural views brought in from the colonizers, right? And so this is where we get a more rigid gender system that we still see in large part today, right? It's very patriarchal and very binary. Part of this is that laws were actually being enacted at this time that would criminalize gender nonconformity and things like cross-dressing with anti-masquerading laws. Okay, so gender norms were enforced not only socially, but this time they're also being enforced legally. Right. So if you did not conform, you would face punishment or some type of discrimination. Okay. So this is important for us because that historical context might not have been something we were familiar with. So we want to see how those things relate to today, like how are we still kind of connecting it, right? So if we were to think about our current society and how things are set up, a couple questions for us to consider to kind of frame our understanding is where do our ideas of masculinity and femininity come from, right? So when you think of what it means to be masculine or what it means to be feminine, like those ideas that come to your mind, that how you would explain those things, where did that come from, right? How did you develop those ideas, right? One of the things that we're also going to see and want to consider is like, how does media influence our understanding of gender, right? So TV shows, movies, music, literature, all these things, how do they also influence us? Okay. So one of the things that we are going to see is there are some major areas where we receive this influence. So primarily we're going to see it within our family. So parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, okay, those core units that we're born into. Your peers, so friends, people your own age, kind of what's going on in schools, media, religion and spirituality that can be a part of it, and then also social media. Okay, so just within those kind of categories, just some examples so we have a frame of reference. You can think of things like toys, right? And the marketing behind toys. We have quote-unquote girl toys and we have quote-unquote boy toys, right? And they're marketed for specific genders based on that, right? There's clothing expectations. This is how a boy should dress. This is how a girl should dress, right? What we're going to see is that if you have a young girl who doesn't dress according to the expected social norms, and you have a young boy who doesn't dress according to expected social norms, that boy, we find through research, actually receives greater scrutiny and pressure to change. Okay, Other examples might be an emotional expectation. So oftentimes you hear that, boys, men, they don't cry, right? That's not biology. Again, that's a societal expectation, right? So we want to consider and kind of think about the media that you interact with, how that might be kind of framing your expectations, right? And how that might differ from the media we have today compared to what it was 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, okay? So there are kind of two theories that play into this. One of them comes from Albert Bandura with social learning theory. He says it's all about observable behavior. We see what other people are doing, and then we try to imitate that behavior, right? So this is something that starts very early when we're young. Children imitate their parents, right? What they see their parents do, what they see their parents say, they're going to imitate those things because that's what they see. That's what they know. So that's one aspect for this. And then a related theory, just to help us kind of understand it a little bit more, is what's called gender schema theory, right? So schema or schemes or mental representations of how we organize information. And so when it comes to anything related to gender, these are the specific organizations or kind of templates that we have. This is what it means to be a man. This is what it means to be feminine or whatever it may be. Okay. So we're not going to go into like a huge depth here, but we just want to recognize that a lot of these things are reinforced socially, right? So it's a social construct. Okay. Now what we're also going to see, this has been a big thing more recently, is something called intersectionality, right? So people will experience gender differently depending on things like race and ethnicity, class, sexuality, culture, or anything that might relate to our identity, right? So we have all these different sections and how they interact with each other. And so depending on what groups, social groups or sections you are a member of, you may actually have like overlapping forms of discrimination, right? So it's something for us to consider because a lot of people are struggling, and we want to see what we can do to always show kindness and respect and for support for other people. So one of the big things that we have seen most recently is that we want to respect people's names and their preferred pronouns. We want to recognize maybe some of the stereotypes that we may hold and how we can challenge those. We want to create inclusive environments where people feel heard and supported and everything. So one of the things, again, just kind of summarize everything. Gender is shaped by culture, history, social interactions. Our understanding of gender continues to evolve, right? So how we understand it today is, again, it's not the same as it was 20 years ago, 50 years ago, okay? And then kind of a thought to leave us with is that if gender expectations are socially constructed, how might societies continue changing the understanding of gender in the future, right? Because we don't have the same view today as we did 50 years ago, what might it look like in 50 years from now, right? How might it continue to change? These are important concepts and ideas for us to reflect on and consider.